It's just incredibly disappointing and frankly quite useless. The hypercoaster. The hypercoaster is a non-inverting coaster type that is capable of very large and smooth hills. It has the second highest support limit in the game at 81 meters and it has the highest single train capacity of all coaster types with a maximum of 42 guests in a 7-car train. This is about everything positive there is to say about the hypercoaster. For this video I will mainly be comparing it to the Hyper Twister as that's the most direct comparison. The Hyper Twister can already be seen as a slightly disappointing version of the Giga Coaster as it's generally just a bit worse in almost every aspect. However, the Hyper Twister is still very good, as tends to be the trend with B&M inspired coaster types. The Hyper Coaster is not just a slightly disappointing version of the Hyper Twister, but an incredibly disappointing version of it. The entire coaster type screams mediocrity. This is a trend with Arrow and Vekoma inspired coasters, as the Corkscrew coaster is kind of a worse version of the Twister coaster and the compact inverted coaster is kind of a worse version of the inverted coaster. However, those two aren't nearly as disappointing as the hypercoaster. Earlier I mentioned the high support limit. It is indeed higher than that of the Hyper Twister, but only by 1 unit, so for most practical purposes they are the same. After this it goes downhill for the hypercoaster. First off, the hypercoaster does not have access to sloped banked turns. This makes it harder to keep your lateral G's in check and it limits your options, especially as the hypercoaster is designed to go very fast most of the time. You might think this is not much of a problem as you can still take unbanked medium turns at 100 km per hour before you get a penalty. But with big drops of more than 50 meters tall it's quite easy to go faster than that. Nitro, for example, would get a lateral G penalty if you replaced the banked sloped turns with unbanked turns. The hypercoaster also has a lower maximum chain lift speed. The Hyper Twister and the Giga Coaster can go up to 12 km per hour, while the Hyper Coaster can go up to only 9 km per hour. This doesn't matter too much on smaller designs, but since the hypercoaster is designed to be big, this often results in incredibly long and slow chain lifts. For the rest of the video I will compare two designs I made for both coasters, one small design and one large design. Before I start hating on it, the hypercoaster does take home another small victory as it is slightly cheaper than the Hyper Twister. It is still on the expensive side if you take all coaster types into account, so this doesn't matter too much. Now let's take a look at the stats. This is where the Hyper Twister easily wins as on both designs it has by far the better stats. The excitement rating is a bit more than 10% higher and the intensity and nausea ratings are very similar. The excitement rating is the most important here as for both coaster types that contributes the most to the park value and the maximum ticket price. Speaking of that, you can charge more than 17% more for the Hyper Twister on both designs. It also gives more than 40% more park value on both designs. This is partly attributed to the higher stats, but also to the fact that the Hyper Twister has slightly higher stat values and a higher ride bonus value. If you want to know more about how this works, you can watch the ride ticket prices and park value videos, but basically a higher stat value means that that stat contributes more to the max ticket price and the park value. The Hyper Twister has higher or equal values for every stat, so even if both rides have the same stat, you can charge more for the Hyper Twister. Because the ride bonus value of the Hyper Twister is also higher than that of the Hyper Coaster, the difference in park value is even larger as this number is also a factor in park value. This higher ride bonus value also means that you will attract more guests if you build a hypertwister than if you build a hypercoaster, especially if you don't advertise. For more information about this, see my video about the harder guest generation. Next up is the throughput. Because the stat for guests per hour can vary a bit, especially on larger designs, I will run both coasters for one in-game year at full capacity and see how many guests they get. For the small design, the hypercoaster has a slightly higher throughput, but not enough to offset the difference in ride ticket price, as the hypertwister has still made more money. This is about as good as it gets for the hypercoaster. If the station was one tile shorter or 2 tiles longer, the hypertwister would have had more trains, leading to a higher throughput. I know that you can use shorter trains as well to optimize the throughput, but the point is that the small design favors the hypercoaster as much as possible, and yet it still loses. On the large design we do see a difference in the number of trains. It has the longest possible station in Vanilla and Classic, which is 12 tiles, and the hypercoaster still only has space for 2 trains. The hypertwister, on the other hand, has space for a 3rd train, as its cars are wider and shorter. This, combined with the slower chain lift on the